Behind the closed doors of seemingly ordinary neighborhoods exist realities, so profoundly disturbing that much of the raw crime scene evidence must remain sealed from this broadcast to comply with platform guidelines. Today we confront 10 meticulously documented cases of extreme captivity, stripping away the sensationalism to examine the dark facts and sheer human endurance that allowed these individuals to escape their subterranean prisons. In the early 1970s, the agricultural city of Merced, California, represented a quintessential slice of quiet, blue-collar American life, where children walked home from school without a shadow of suspicion. The Stainer family epitomized this mid-century domestic normalcy, raising their 5 children in an environment where neighborhood boundaries were the only real parameters of safety. 7-year-old Stephen Stainer was known among his peers and family as an energetic, deeply trusting boy who spent his afternoons playing in the sprawling suburban streets of the San Joaquin Valley. His father, Delbert, and his mother, Kay, provided a stable, loving household that functioned exactly as one would expect during an era when the concept of stranger danger had not yet permeated the national consciousness. Days were measured by school bells and the fading afternoon sun, creating a profound sense of security that enveloped the entire community. There were no underlying tensions or red flags in Stephen's daily routine, and the trajectory of his childhood seemed utterly predictable and secure. The local community was tightly knit, a place where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors routinely looked out for one another's children. This baseline of absolute normalcy is critical to understanding the devastation that was about to unfold, highlighting how abruptly tragedy can strike a family completely unprepared for malice. Stephen's innocence and his natural inclination to respect adults made him an ideal target for a predator operating with calculated precision. Ultimately, the idyllic nature of his early years would serve as a heartbreaking contrast to the dark, psychological labyrinth he was about to enter, forever fracturing the foundation of his family's existence. The irrevocable turning point occurred on the gloomy, rain-swept afternoon of December 4, 1972, fundamentally obliterating the Stainer family's reality and initiating a living nightmare. As Stephen was walking home from school, a vehicle approached him, occupied by a convicted child molester named Kenneth Parnell and his accomplice, Irvin Murphy. Operating with practiced deceit, Parnell approached the young boy under the benign guise of distributing religious literature, a tactic specifically designed to disarm a polite, cooperative child. Stephen, raised to be helpful, respectful to adults, engaged with the men without hesitation, a decision born entirely of innocence rather than carelessness. Within moments, the facade dropped, and Stephen was lured into the vehicle, marking the absolute point of no return as the doors locked and the car sped away from Merced. The immediate aftermath was characterized by total chaos as his parents realized he had not returned home, triggering a frantic but ultimately desperate search by local law enforcement. Police combed the area, interviewed neighbors, and distributed flyers, yet the trail had gone entirely cold almost the second Stephen entered Parnell's car. The community of Merced was left grappling with the sudden realization that monsters could seamlessly infiltrate their quiet streets and vanish without a trace. This singular event shifted the paradigm of the entire region, injecting a permanent undercurrent of fear into what was once a secure environment. The agonizing lack of evidence left investigators grappling with shadows, while the Stainer family was thrust into an unbearable limbo of unresolved grief and relentless questioning. Parnell's swift and untraceable extraction of the boy demonstrated a terrifying level of predatory competence, setting the stage for one of the most prolonged and psychologically complex missing persons cases in American history. Over the next 7 years, Stephen endured an unfathomable ordeal characterized by systemic psychological conditioning, geographical displacement, and severe institutional failures that allowed his captor to remain undetected. Parnell relocated his victim hundreds of miles away to various isolated properties in Northern California, systematically stripping away the boy's identity and renaming him Dennis. The psychological manipulation was relentless and calculated, Parnell convinced Stephen that his parents no longer wanted him, that they had surrendered custody, and that Parnell was his legal guardian. This insidious form of brainwashing, combined with the extreme isolation and dependence fostered by his captor, effectively paralyzed Stephen's ability to seek help even when opportunities occasionally presented themselves. Law enforcement's failure to connect Parnell, a man with a documented history of severe offenses against children, to the high-profile disappearance in Merst represents a catastrophic breakdown in inter-agency communication and investigative oversight. The failure to connect the dots allowed a known predator to hide a stolen child in plain sight for nearly a decade. Stephen was even enrolled in local high schools under his false identity, walking through crowded hallways and sitting in classrooms completely undetected by teachers and authorities who failed to recognize the missing child, plastered on statewide posters. As the years progressed, the psychological chains proved far stronger than any physical restraints, keeping Stephen trapped in a perpetual state of trauma, fear, and manufactured loyalty. Detectives periodically chased dead-end leads and investigated false sightings, but the core investigation stagnated, leaving the Stainer family trapped in a holding pattern of agonizing uncertainty. The sheer duration of this captivity allowed Parnell to operate with an increasing sense of impunity, believing he had successfully outsmarted the entire criminal justice system. However, the dynamics of this dark confinement began to shift fundamentally as Stephen grew older, developing an internal moral compass that would ultimately challenge the twisted reality Parnell had constructed. The tension shattered, and the narrative reached its explosive culmination in February 1980, when Parnell's insatiable predatory compulsions drove him to abduct another child, setting off a chain of events he could not control. Seeking a younger victim as Stephen aged into his teenage years, Parnell kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White in the town of Ukiah, dragging the terrified boy back to the same remote cabin where Stephen had been held captive. Witnessing the weeping child, Stephen was struck by a profound, agonizing realization: Timothy was doomed to suffer the exact same horrors, the same erasure of identity, and the same psychological destruction that had defined Stephen's entire existence. This realization served as a powerful catalyst, breaking through years of intense brainwashing and igniting an unwavering resolve within the teenager to stop the cycle of abuse. On the night of March 1, 1980, while Parnell was distracted and away from the immediate vicinity, Stephen executed a desperate and highly dangerous escape plan. He gathered little Timothy, quietly slipped out of the cabin into the freezing night, and managed to secure a ride hitchhiking, before eventually finding a motorcycle they used to flee the area. The journey through the dark, winding roads of Northern California was fraught with the terrifying possibility of Parnell pursuing them in the darkness. Stephen navigated the treacherous route with a singular focus, driven by the absolute necessity of delivering the child to safety, regardless of the consequences to himself. They finally arrived at the police station in Ukiah, where a trembling Stephen walked up to the front desk, with Timothy in tow, definitively declaring his true identity to a stunned desk officer. In that single, defining moment at the front desk, the captive became the hero, bringing an end to the nightmare that had consumed his youth. This monumental act of bravery not only saved a young boy's life, but utterly dismantled Parnell's meticulously constructed empire of abuse, initiating the immediate downfall of the predator. The immediate aftermath of the escape triggered a massive law enforcement response, resulting in the swift apprehension and subsequent conviction of Kenneth Parnell for the kidnapping of both boys. Parnell was ultimately sentenced to prison, though the leniency of his initial sentence, serving just 5 years before parole, sparked intense public outrage and highlighted severe inadequacies in the legal system regarding child exploitation. The judicial system's failure to keep Parnell incarcerated for life underscored a glaring flaw in how society protected its most vulnerable members during that era. Stephen's return to his family was heavily covered by the national media, but the transition was painfully difficult, as he struggled to bridge the massive gap between the child who vanished and the traumatized teenager who returned. Despite intense psychological struggles and the relentless pressure of public scrutiny, Stephen managed to build a life marrying and having 2 children. While continually advocating for missing children and stronger legislative protections, the profound scars left on the Stainer family serve as a permanent reminder of the collateral damage inflicted by such predators. Tragically, his life was cut short in 1989 at the age of 24, when he was killed in a hit-and-run motorcycle accident. A devastating end to a life defined by unimaginable hardship and extraordinary heroism. Timothy White, whose life was unequivocally saved by Stephen's intervention, grew up to become a sheriff's deputy, dedicating his own life to public safety and honoring the legacy of the teenager who carried him out of the darkness. The case of Stephen Stainer remains a foundational study in the psychological mechanisms of prolonged captivity and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. While Stephen managed to break free and dismantle his captor's control from the inside, other investigations required the intervention of highly specialized law enforcement tactics to pierce the veil of secrecy. Such was the terrifying reality facing investigators in South Carolina decades later, when a desperate search for a missing couple led them directly to the heavily fortified gates of an active serial killer's sprawling compound. In the late summer of 2016, 30-year-old Calla Brown and her 32-year-old boyfriend, Charles Carver, were navigating the typical challenges and routines of a quiet, working-class life in Anderson, South Carolina. The couple had recently moved in together, building a shared domestic existence grounded in everyday aspirations and steady employment. Charles was known among his friends and family as a dependable, mild-mannered man who cared deeply for Calla, while Calla herself was recognized for her bright disposition and strong connections to her social circle. They supported themselves by taking on various labor-intensive jobs, frequently working together to clean up properties, clear brush, and prepare real estate for prospective buyers. This line of work was demanding but entirely ordinary, integrating them seamlessly into the local gig economy, where word-of-mouth recommendations served as their primary source of income. Their days were characterized by the predictable rhythm of manual labor, evening routines at home, and regular communication with their respective families. There was absolutely nothing in their background or daily habits to suggest they were engaging in high-risk behavior or courting any form of danger. They operated within a sphere of absolute normalcy, trusting the professional boundaries of their clients and the general safety of their rural community. The landscape of upstate South Carolina, with its sprawling properties and quiet county roads, provided a tranquil backdrop to their shared lives, masking the isolated dangers that such rural expanses can sometimes conceal. This mundane reality is crucial to emphasize, as it highlights how easily 2 responsible adults, simply trying to earn an honest living, could be lured into a devastating trap orchestrated under the completely unremarkable guise of routine employment. The abrupt and chilling fracture in their predictable lives occurred on August 31, 2016, when Calla and Charles traveled to a remote property in Spartanburg County for a clearing job, never to be seen in their normal capacity again. They had been hired by a local real estate agent named Todd Colehep to clear underbrush on his newly purchased, heavily wooded 95-acre lot in the town of Moore. Almost immediately after they arrived at the sprawling rural compound, all legitimate communication from the couple ceased completely, plunging their families into a state of acute anxiety. The absolute point of no return was solidified when friends and family noticed a disturbing and highly anomalous shift in Charles's digital footprint in the days following their disappearance. His Facebook profile suddenly became active with bizarre, uncharacteristic posts claiming that he and Calla had spontaneously married, bought a house, and were taking time away from everyone they knew. The language, tone, and grammar of these digital updates were entirely foreign to those who knew Charles well, instantly signaling to his loved ones that someone else had commandeered his account to manufacture a false narrative. These fabricated posts were strategically designed to deter any search efforts, projecting a deceptive illusion of domestic bliss while masking a grim, underlying reality. Instead of alleviating concerns, this crude psychological manipulation only amplified the panic, prompting the families to bypass the digital smoke screen and officially involve local law enforcement. The sudden vanishing act, combined with the sinister digital masquerade, fundamentally shifted the situation from a routine missing persons inquiry into a high-stakes investigation of a deeply suspicious, involuntary disappearance. The realization that a malicious third party was actively taunting the families online set off immediate, frantic alarms across multiple law enforcement agencies. For 2 agonizing months, investigators waded through a frustrating quagmire of dead-end leads, false tips, and the unsettling silence emanating from the missing couple's actual whereabouts. Detectives meticulously analyzed the bizarre Facebook activity, serving subpoenas to tech companies in an effort to trace the IP addresses and digital origins of the fraudulent posts that continued to mock the frantic families. Simultaneously, law enforcement focused heavily on cellular data, attempting to map the final digital footprints of Kala and Charles's mobile devices before they were deliberately powered down or destroyed. This meticulous technological forensic work slowly began to yield crucial geographic coordinates, narrowing the search radius away from their hometown and pointing directly toward the rural expanses of Spartanburg County. The investigation's momentum accelerated significantly when the cellular pings and final known communications definitively linked the couple to the massive tract of land owned by Todd Kohlhepp. A deep background check on Kohlhepp immediately elevated the threat level to maximum severity, revealing that the seemingly successful real estate broker was actually a registered sex offender with a violent criminal history dating back to his adolescence. Armed with this alarming intelligence, investigators recognized the immense danger of the situation and immediately began organizing a large-scale tactical operation to breach the heavily fortified, chain-link fenced perimeter of Kohlhepp's property. The sheer scale of the compound presented a daunting logistical challenge, requiring search teams to navigate dense vegetation, multiple outbuildings, and the very real possibility of armed resistance from a man who meticulously guarded his privacy. As the search warrants were finalized and the tactical teams assembled on the morning of November 3, 2016, the atmosphere was thick with a grim, unspoken understanding that the sprawling acreage likely concealed a horrific crime scene. Every available unit was deployed, effectively locking down the perimeter to ensure that whatever secrets the property held would finally be exposed to the light of day. The investigation reached its harrowing peak when heavily armed deputies and search dogs breached the gates of the Moore compound, systematically sweeping the vast, overgrown property under the tense quiet of the rural morning. As investigators carefully navigated the treacherous terrain, their attention was drawn to a massive, green metal shipping container sitting isolated amidst the dense foliage. Through the thick metal walls, officers suddenly detected a faint, rhythmic banging sound, a desperate acoustic signal that instantly escalated the methodical search into a frantic, high-stakes rescue operation. Moving rapidly to the source, law enforcement utilized heavy tools to sever the heavy-duty padlocks securing the formidable steel doors of the windowless, pitch-black container. As the doors swung open, the tactical teams were confronted with a scene of unimaginable psychological and physical degradation, illuminating the absolute depths of Kohlhepp's depravity. Inside the sweltering, claustrophobic metal box, investigators found Kala Brown sitting on a makeshift bed, chained by her neck to the interior wall, surrounded by scattered provisions and the absolute darkness of her prolonged confinement. The sheer visual shock of the heavy chain and padlocks, securing a human being in complete isolation, left seasoned law enforcement officers momentarily stunned before they rushed to dismantle the restraints. In those chaotic adrenaline-fueled moments of liberation, Kala maintained enough composure to deliver a devastating piece of intelligence to her rescuers regarding her missing boyfriend. She explicitly informed the heavily armed officers that Todd Kohlhepp had shot Charles Carver 3 times in the chest in front of her on the very day they arrived, effectively confirming the presence of an active serial killer on the grounds. This chilling revelation instantly shifted the operational parameters, transforming the rescue site into a sprawling, active homicide investigation requiring immediate containment. The immediate rescue of Kala Brown triggered the rapid apprehension of Todd Kohlhepp, who was arrested on the property later that same day without offering significant resistance. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the surviving testimony of his captive, Kohlhepp waived his rights and began a chilling, methodical confession to investigators that shocked the entire state of South Carolina. He directed authorities to the shallow graves on his property, leading to the heartbreaking recovery of Charles Carver's remains, along with the bodies of two other previously missing individuals, Megan Coxey and Johnny Coxey. Furthermore, Kohlhepp casually confessed to the unsolved 2003 Superbike Motorsports quadruple homicide, completely closing a brutal cold case that had haunted the region for over a decade. To avoid the death penalty, Kohlhepp pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct, resulting in a sentence of 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sprawling 95-acre property was subsequently scoured by forensic anthropologists and ultimately liquidated. The proceeds directed toward the families of the victims and the survivors of his reign of terror. Calla Brown's unimaginable resilience in the face of absolute despair provided the crucial catalyst needed to permanently dismantle a prolific serial killer's hidden empire. While her nightmare unfolded within the sweltering confines of an above-ground shipping container in the rural American South, our next case shifts to a European suburb, where a child's sudden disappearance would plunge her into a subterranean vault designed for total, absolute erasure from the surface world. In the late 1990s, the Donaustadt district of Vienna, Austria, functioned as a bustling, densely populated residential area where the daily routines of thousands of families unfolded with predictable regularity. 10-year-old Natasha Kampusch was deeply embedded in this urban environment, navigating her childhood with a mix of typical pre-adolescent independence and the lingering emotional complexities of her parents' recent separation. Despite the domestic shifts, her daily life was firmly anchored in the standard expectations of a European schoolchild, consisting of morning commutes, classroom hours, and afternoon activities. The morning of March 2, 1998 began under completely unremarkable circumstances. Natasha had a minor, typical argument with her mother before leaving the apartment to begin her brief, familiar walk to school. She was dressed for the lingering late winter chill, carrying her backpack and blending seamlessly into the morning rush of commuters and fellow students traversing the district's sidewalks. There was absolutely nothing about her demeanor, her route, or the surrounding environment to suggest that she was actively being targeted, nor that her short walk would become the focal point of a massive national crisis. Her route was straightforward, well-traveled, and historically safe, a path walked by countless children without incident. This profound banality is essential to understanding the stark terror of what followed, emphasizing that danger can silently intersect with the most routine moments of domestic life. The safety net of her community was an illusion, entirely inadequate to protect her from an individual who had spent months meticulously planning the complete erasure of a child from the surface world. The absolute fracture in Natasha's existence occurred precisely at 7:00 a.m., when her normal morning commute was violently interrupted by a white Mercedes minibus parked strategically along her route. The driver, a 36-year-old communications technician named Wolfgang Pieliklopil, had been quietly observing her movements and acted with terrifying speed and precision. In a matter of seconds, he grabbed the 10-year-old girl and dragged her into the vehicle, slamming the door shut and accelerating away before the few potential witnesses could fully comprehend what had just transpired. When Natasha failed to arrive at school or return home that afternoon, her mother immediately contacted the authorities, triggering one of the most extensive and desperate missing child investigations in modern Austrian history. The police rapidly mobilized, establishing checkpoints, distributing thousands of flyers bearing Natasha's photograph, and dragging nearby bodies of water in a frantic search for any trace of the missing girl. A massive dragnet was cast across Vienna and its surrounding provinces, with investigators interviewing hundreds of registered owners of white minibuses, matching the vague descriptions provided by a single 12-year-old witness. The public response was overwhelming, yet the sheer volume of tips often muddied the waters, leading detectives down countless frustrating dead ends. The terrifying reality was that Natasha had not simply vanished into the urban sprawl, she had been transported to a residential suburb, just miles away, and physically lowered into a custom-built, soundproof subterranean vault hidden beneath P. Iklopil's garage. This impenetrable concrete cell, measuring merely 5 square meters, represented the absolute point of no return, effectively sealing the child off from the massive search operation unfolding directly above her head. For the next 96 days, Natasha endured an existence defined by extreme physical confinement and relentless psychological warfare within the suffocating darkness of P.A. Iklopil's cellar. The architectural reality of her prison, secured by thick concrete, a reinforced steel vault door, and complex electronic locking mechanisms, rendered any physical escape attempt entirely impossible for a small child. P.A. Iklopil initiated a brutal campaign of psychological conditioning, systematically attempting to break down her identity and replace it with absolute dependence on him for basic survival needs like food, water, and electricity. He enforced strict, erratic rules regarding hygiene and behavior, utilizing periods of total darkness and starvation as punitive measures to maintain absolute control over her physical and mental state. Astonishingly, during the early stages of the investigation, local police had actually interviewed P.A. Iklopil at his home as part of the mass screening of white minibus owners. However, he provided a plausible alibi and allowed a cursory visual inspection of the property, successfully deceiving the detectives who failed to detect the massive subterranean bunker, hidden directly beneath their feet. This catastrophic intelligence failure allowed the captivity to continue uninterrupted for years, as the official police investigation slowly lost momentum and transitioned into a cold case. As Natasha transitioned from a child into a teenager within the confines of the cell, she began to employ complex psychological survival tactics, feigning compliance and submission while quietly nurturing an intense, unwavering resolve to escape. She engaged in a terrifying daily performance, balancing the unpredictable volatility of her captor with her own desperate need to eventually access the surface world. This immense psychological fortitude allowed her to gradually earn minor, heavily supervised excursions outside the cell, setting the stage for a critical lapse in P.A. Iklopil's meticulous security protocols. The unbearable tension finally shattered on the afternoon of August 23, 2006, when 18-year-old Natasha identified a fleeting, high-stakes opportunity to execute the escape she had visualized for 8 years. P. Iklopil had ordered her to clean his BMW in the driveway of his Strashov property, a task she was performing while under his intense, constant supervision. The crucial turning point occurred when P.A. Iklopil received a phone call on his mobile device. The loud noise of the vacuum cleaner Natasha was using forced him to walk a few steps away to hear the conversation clearly. Recognizing that this was the first time in over 3,000 days she had a clear, albeit momentary, path to the open street without his immediate physical interference, she made a definitive life-altering decision. Dropping the vacuum, she sprinted through the open gate of the property, running frantically through the suburban neighborhood, while terrified that P.A. Iklopil would immediately realize she was gone and pursue her. She scrambled over fences and darted through gardens, fueled by sheer adrenaline and the absolute terror of being dragged back into the subterranean vault. She finally reached the window of an elderly neighbor, knocking desperately and frantically explaining her true identity to the bewildered woman inside, who immediately contacted the local authorities. When the police arrived, they found a pale, trembling young woman who firmly stated her name, ending one of the longest and most heavily publicized missing persons cases in the nation's history. In that singular moment of extraordinary courage, Natasha permanently severed the psychological and physical chains of her captivity, instantly dismantling the horrific reality P.A. Iklopil had maintained for nearly a decade. The immediate realization that Natasha had successfully escaped triggered a massive, frantic manhunt for Wolfgang P. Iklopil, who fled the scene in his vehicle the moment he discovered she was gone. Recognizing that the absolute control he had maintained for 8 years was destroyed, and that severe penal consequences were imminent, P.A. Iklopil abandoned his car and ultimately stepped in front of a moving commuter train in Vienna, committing suicide to permanently evade prosecution. The discovery of the elaborate, heavily fortified dungeon beneath his garage sent shockwaves through the international community, horrifying investigators who documented the extreme physical security measures utilized to conceal the child. The Austrian government faced intense internal and public scrutiny over the massive early investigative failures, specifically the missed opportunity to uncover the dungeon during the initial 1998 interview. Natasha Kampusch faced an incredibly complex and highly publicized reintegration into society, navigating severe trauma and intense media intrusion as she attempted to reclaim the life that was stolen from her. She subsequently purchased a house where she was held captive to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction, and she has written extensively about her experiences to maintain control over her own narrative. Her survival stands as a profound testament to the human capacity for psychological endurance under conditions designed to obliterate the spirit. Yet, while Natasha was hidden beneath a quiet European suburb, our next investigation pulls us back to the American Midwest, where a seemingly quirky neighborhood vendor was quietly maintaining a meticulously documented chamber of torture directly behind the facade of his local oddities shop. In the vibrant Westport district of Kansas City, Missouri during the 1980s, the local community functioned as a close, knit enclave where eccentric personalities were often embraced as part of the neighborhood's unique cultural fabric. Robert Berdella seamlessly integrated himself into this bohemian environment, operating a highly visible stall called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar at a popular local flea market, where he sold animal skulls, occult items, and antique oddities to a steady stream of fascinated customers. To his neighbors on Charlotte Street, Berdella projected the image of a gruff, but fundamentally civic-minded resident who took an active interest in maintaining the safety and stability of his immediate surroundings. He actually founded and led the local Neighborhood Watch program, routinely collaborating with local law enforcement to report minor infractions and keeping a vigilant eye out for suspicious activities in the area. Furthermore, he regularly volunteered his time and resources to cook large meals for local charities and community events, cementing his reputation as a harmless, albeit unusual, local fixture. This carefully cultivated public persona provided the ultimate camouflage, allowing him to operate completely above suspicion while interacting daily with the very authorities who would later hunt him. The demographic he inhabited was characterized by a live and let live mentality, a social dynamic that inherently discouraged people from prying too deeply into the private affairs occurring behind closed residential doors. His victims, conversely, were frequently young men navigating precarious life circumstances, operating on the fringes of society where their sudden absences were less likely to generate immediate, high-profile alarm. This absolute baseline of neighborhood trust and social compartmentalization is critical to understanding how a prolific serial killer managed to maintain a permanent residence in a crowded suburban block without triggering a single warning sign. The facade of the eccentric merchant was so flawlessly executed that it completely blinded the community to the predatory calculus governing Berdella's every interaction, establishing a deadly environment where absolute trust routinely intersected with calculated malice. The horrifying shift from a quiet neighborhood existence to a lethal hunting ground began subtly in 1984, marked by the systematic and completely unheralded disappearances of several young men from the Kansas City metropolitan area. Individuals like Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, and Todd Stoops vanished sequentially into the urban landscape, leaving behind baffled families and abruptly abandoned lives that failed to register as a cohesive crisis within the local police department. Because many of these young men struggled with substance abuse or lived transient lifestyles, law enforcement agencies largely categorized their disappearances as voluntary runaways rather than potential victims of foul play. This institutional dismissal effectively severed the connection between the missing men, preventing detectives from identifying the distinct geographic and social patterns that pointed directly to Berdella's doorstep. The lack of a unified investigative task force allowed the perpetrator to refine his abduction methodologies without any fear of surveillance or sudden police intervention, creating an open season on marginalized individuals. Berdella actively exploited this societal blind spot, deliberately selecting targets he knew the system would inherently devalue and overlook in the critical initial hours following an abduction. The quiet evaporation of these men serves as the inciting incident for the broader tragedy, highlighting a catastrophic failure in how the justice system prioritized missing persons cases based on social standing rather than objective risk. As the years progressed and the list of missing individuals quietly expanded, the silence surrounding their fates only emboldened Berdella, solidifying his belief that he existed completely outside the reach of the law. This sustained period of investigative dormancy transformed a series of individual tragedies into a localized epidemic of violence, allowing a meticulous predator to operate a private detention center within a bustling urban grid. The sheer volume of missing persons reports piling up in archive boxes represented a ticking clock, one that would only be stopped by the unimaginable endurance of a final victim who refused to become another forgotten statistic. The reality concealed behind the heavy doors of 4315 Charlotte Street was a stark contrast to Berdella's public life, functioning as a highly organized environment designed specifically for prolonged human torture and systematic documentation. Berdella treated his crimes as clinical experiments, maintaining incredibly detailed, handwritten journals that logged the precise dosages of animal tranquilizers, chemical injections, and electrical shocks he administered to his captives over periods lasting up to 6 weeks. He augmented these written records with hundreds of Polaroid photographs, meticulously cataloging the physical and psychological degradation of the young men as they were subjected to escalating levels of extreme violence in his second-story bedroom. This horrific routine reached its absolute peak in early April 1988, when Berdella abducted 22-year-old Chris Bryson, plunging the young man into a nightmarish cycle of abuse that mirrored the exact protocols used on the previous, deceased victims. Bryson was immediately restrained, stripped of his clothing, and subjected to days of unimaginable torment, kept bound like an animal, while his captor documented every reaction with chilling, scientific detachment. Despite being heavily sedated and repeatedly tortured, Bryson managed to maintain a desperate, underlying situational awareness, acutely observing Berdella's routines and searching for any microscopic lapse in the intense security protocols governing his captivity. The psychological toll on Bryson was immense, as he was forced to endure not only the physical pain, but the terrifying realization that his captor had perfected this process over years, without ever facing an interruption from the outside world. Law enforcement remained completely oblivious to the crisis unfolding on Charlotte Street, their patrols routinely driving past the very house where a citizen was fighting a minute-by-minute battle for basic survival. Bryson recognized with absolute clarity that no rescue party was coming for him, and that his only chance of avoiding the fate meticulously detailed in Berdella's journals was to orchestrate his own violent extraction. This grueling war of attrition inside the house forced Bryson to push his physical and mental limits to the absolute breaking point, biding his time in agonizing silence until the perfect, singular moment materialized. The agonizing standoff reached its explosive culmination on the early morning of April 2, 1988, when a momentary lapse in Berdella's strict operational discipline presented Bryson with a rapidly closing window for survival. Berdella had temporarily left the second-story bedroom to tend to matters in another part of the house, failing to ensure that Bryson's heavy restraints were fully secured following a prolonged session of torture. Seizing this incredibly narrow opportunity, the battered and exhausted young man summoned a massive surge of adrenaline, managing to completely slip his bonds and free himself from the immediate confinement of the bed. Wearing absolutely nothing but a heavy animal collar secured tightly around his neck, Bryson bypassed the interior stairs and instead lunged toward the bedroom window. Recognizing that the front door was likely fortified or heavily guarded, without a second of hesitation, he threw himself through the second-story glass, plummeting to the ground below and sustaining additional lacerations and injuries upon impact with the concrete pavement. Fueled entirely by the sheer terror of recapture, Bryson scrambled to his feet and sprinted across the property line, throwing himself onto the front porch of a neighboring residence and desperately pounding on the door. The neighbor, utterly shocked by the sight of a severely injured, bleeding man wearing a collar and begging for his life, immediately pulled him inside and dialed emergency services. Within minutes, Kansas City police cruisers converged on the quiet residential street, securing the perimeter and providing immediate trauma care to the frantic survivor, who firmly pointed them toward Berdella's property. This singular, incredibly dangerous leap from a second-story window abruptly shattered Berdella's carefully constructed empire of violence, instantly transforming the eccentric neighborhood vendor into the prime suspect of a massive tactical police raid. In that chaotic morning confrontation, Chris Bryson's extraordinary physical courage not only saved his own life, but definitively ended one of the most prolific and secretive killing sprees in the city's history. The subsequent raid on the Charlotte Street residence provided investigators with a staggering volume of undeniable forensic evidence, immediately clarifying the fates of the young men who had vanished over the previous 4 years. Detectives executing the search warrant recovered Berdella's extensive torture journals, hundreds of graphic Polaroid photographs, and 2 human skulls buried in the backyard, permanently corroborating Bryson's harrowing account of his captivity. Faced with a mountain of meticulously self-documented evidence and the very real prospect of facing the death penalty, Berdella chose to cooperate with prosecutors, ultimately signing a comprehensive plea agreement. In a chillingly pragmatic confession, he detailed how he had dismembered his previous victims and disposed of their remains in heavy-duty garbage bags, allowing the city's municipal trash collection to unknowingly carry the evidence to a local landfill. Berdella was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, permanently removing him from society and providing a grim measure of legal closure to the devastated families of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, and Todd Stoops. The Kansas City Police Department faced intense public criticism for their failure to adequately investigate the initial disappearances, prompting a permanent shift in how marginalized missing persons cases were subsequently handled by local authorities. In October 1992, just 4 years into his life sentence, Bob Berdella died of a massive heart attack in his cell, bringing a quiet, unceremonious end to the life of a highly organized predator. The residence on Charlotte Street was eventually demolished by the city, erasing the physical footprint of the horrors that occurred there, though the legacy of the case remains a foundational study in the deceptive nature of suburban normalcy. As we transition from the Midwest to the industrial neighborhoods of Ohio, the terrifying concept of residential captivity emerges once again, demonstrating how a trusted community figure can weaponize his own home to conceal a nightmare lasting over a decade. In the early 2000s, the working-class neighborhoods of Cleveland, Ohio represented a tapestry of tightly knit, resilient communities where generations of families shared interconnected lives across bustling city blocks. The daily rhythm of these urban environments was dictated by the predictable schedules of local schools, public transit routes, and neighborhood businesses that formed the backbone of the local economy. 16-year-old Amanda Berry and 14-year-old Gina DeJesus were 2 young women deeply embedded within this vibrant demographic, navigating the standard challenges and aspirations of American adolescence. Amanda was known as a dependable, hardworking teenager who balanced her academic responsibilities with a part-time job at a local fast food restaurant, actively saving money to buy new clothes and establish her independence. Gina, slightly younger, was universally described by her teachers and family as a warm, bright presence whose social life revolved heavily around her middle school friends and her deeply protective family structure. Their respective daily routines involved walking through familiar streets, utilizing the public infrastructure, and interacting with neighborhood figures without any pervasive sense of immediate, localized danger. The streets they navigated were populated by familiar faces, including local shop owners, crossing guards, and municipal workers, creating an overarching illusion of communal security that residents heavily relied upon. There was absolutely nothing in either girls' behavior, social circles, or daily habits to suggest they were engaging in high-risk activities that might invite predatory attention. They operated entirely within the expected boundaries of youth, trusting the foundational safety of their hometown as they walked from school and work toward the sanctuary of their respective homes. The localized environment provided a false sense of absolute invulnerability, blinding the community to the reality that dangerous individuals could easily blend into the background noise of urban existence. This profound baseline of ordinary urban existence is essential to understanding the sheer shock of their sudden erasure, highlighting how a completely trusted environment can instantly become a frictionless hunting ground for a predator hiding in plain sight. The devastating fracture in this communal security occurred through a series of separate, brazen daylight abductions that permanently altered the psychological landscape of Cleveland and plunged multiple families into unimaginable grief. On April 21, 2003, exactly one day before her 17th birthday, Amanda Berry finished her evening shift at Burger King and accepted a ride from Ariel Castro, the father of a former co-worker. Completely trusting his familiar face, once inside his vehicle, she was swiftly transported to his residence on Seymour Avenue, permanently crossing the threshold into a fortified domestic dungeon, where she would soon realize she was not the first victim, joining Michelle Knight, who had been abducted in 2002. Just over a year later, on April 2004, 14-year-old Gina DeJesus was walking home from her middle school when she encountered the same seemingly benign neighborhood figure along her typical route. Castro used his own daughter's friendship with Gina to successfully lower her defenses and lure her into his car under the guise of offering a safe ride home. Castro's ability to leverage superficial community trust and familial connections allowed him to execute these kidnappings without using public violence, effectively neutralizing any potential interference from passing witnesses or nearby residents. The immediate aftermath of each disappearance was characterized by total, suffocating panic as the respective families realized their daughters had vanished in broad daylight from the very streets they had walked hundreds of times. These separate, but identical points of no return initiated massive, desperate mobilization efforts by both the local community and law enforcement agencies, fundamentally shifting the city's atmosphere from one of routine safety to one of intense, pervasive dread. The agonizing lack of physical evidence, discarded belongings, or credible eyewitness accounts left detectives grappling with an investigative void, unable to trace the precise trajectories the girls took after leaving their last known locations. Without any tangible forensic threads to pull, the missing persons cases quickly stagnated, leaving the families trapped in a prolonged holding pattern of agonizing uncertainty and endless questioning. This abrupt, untraceable vanishing act demonstrated a terrifying level of predatory efficiency, entirely erasing two vibrant young lives from the surface world and leaving a profound, haunting void within the heart of their community. For the next decade, the city of Cleveland witnessed an unprecedented, exhausting search effort marked by heartbreaking dead ends, massive community mobilization, and systemic investigative blind spots. Local police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted thousands of interviews, chased down hundreds of false tips, and organized large-scale grid searches. Yet they repeatedly failed to look closely at the unassuming residential structure, located just miles from where the girls disappeared. During these agonizing years of public vigils and relentlessly televised appeals by the devastated families, Amanda, Gina, and Michelle were enduring a hidden reality of extreme physical constraint, severe psychological abuse, and absolute isolation. Castro maintained a chillingly bifurcated existence, continuing to work his municipal job as a school bus driver and playing bass guitar in local bands, utilizing the noise of urban life to drown out any evidence of the horrors occurring within his property. He systematically fortified the interior architecture of his home, installing heavy padlocks, thick chains, and rudimentary alarm systems on bedroom doors to ensure his captives could never breach the perimeter without his immediate, violent intervention. The systemic failures of law enforcement and child protective services to adequately investigate previous domestic complaints at the address represent a catastrophic oversight that effectively granted Castro an uninterrupted decade of absolute impunity. Inside the house, the psychological warfare was relentless, as Castro manipulated the women by pitting them against each other and forcing them to endure unimaginable conditions of sensory deprivation and starvation. This prolonged abuse culminated in a medically unassisted delivery when Amanda gave birth to a daughter, Jocelyn, inside a small plastic wading pool in 2006, adding a profound new layer of vulnerability to their captive existence. The steady passage of time slowly eroded the public's hope of finding the victims alive, transforming the active investigation into a cold case heavily burdened by the bleak assumption that the girls had been moved out of state or murdered. Yet, despite the crushing weight of their prolonged confinement, the captives developed incredibly complex, silent survival strategies to preserve their sanity. They continuously monitored Castro's rigid security protocols for years on end, waiting with agonizing patience for the microscopic structural failure that might eventually grant them a narrow path to the outside world. The unbearable, decade-long tension finally shattered on the evening of May 6, 2013, when a momentary lapse in Castro's obsessive security routine provided Amanda with a highly precarious, rapidly closing window for liberation. Castro had left the house to run errands, and in a rare, uncharacteristic error born of complacency, he failed to properly secure the heavy interior door that separated the captives' living quarters from the front entryway. Realizing that the primary structural barrier holding them back was finally compromised, Amanda grabbed her 6-year-old daughter and pushed her way to the front porch, only to find the exterior aluminum storm door firmly locked and completely unyielding. Recognizing that this was the absolute most critical moment of her entire life, she began to scream frantically, violently shaking the lower panel of the storm door and desperately trying to attract the attention of anyone passing on the busy street. Her agonizing cries pierced the ambient noise of the neighborhood, immediately drawing the attention of neighbors Charles Ramsey and Angel Cordero, who rushed to the porch to investigate the sudden, violent commotion. Through a narrow gap in the door, Amanda practically pleaded with the men, stating her identity as the missing girl from the news and begging them to help her escape before her captor returned to exact a lethal punishment. Driven by pure adrenaline and the desperate urgency of her pleas, Ramsey and Cordero kicked out the bottom aluminum panel of the locked storm door, creating a jagged opening just large enough for Amanda to squeeze through. Clad in mismatched clothing and trembling with absolute terror, she squeezed through the broken metal with her young daughter in her arms, physically crossing the threshold into freedom for the first time in 10 years. She immediately ran to a neighboring house to dial emergency services, breathlessly informing the police dispatcher that she had been kidnapped 10 years ago, that she was finally free, and that other women were still trapped inside. This chaotic, heart-stopping breach of the fortified house instantly dismantled a decade of meticulously maintained terror, shifting the dynamic from a hidden nightmare to an active, massive law enforcement response. Within minutes of Amanda's frantic emergency call, heavily armed Cleveland police officers descended upon Seymour Avenue, immediately breaching the residence to locate and successfully rescue Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight from the dark, barricaded upper floor. The tactical clearance of the house exposed an intricate network of chains, heavy-duty tape, and makeshift barricades, providing investigators with undeniable, horrifying physical evidence of the prolonged, systematic torture the women had endured. Ariel Castro was apprehended later that same evening at a local fast food restaurant, completely unprepared for the sudden, catastrophic collapse of the secret empire he had maintained for over 10 years. Confronted with an overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence, definitive DNA confirmation of his paternity regarding Amanda's daughter, and the surviving testimonies of 3 distinct victims, Castro ultimately accepted a comprehensive plea agreement to avoid the death penalty. He formally pleaded guilty to 937 criminal counts, including aggravated murder for terminating Knight's pregnancies through forced starvation and physical beatings. resulting in an unprecedented sentence of life imprisonment plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. Just 1 month into his incarceration, Castro committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell, permanently terminating his ability to manipulate the narrative and providing a grim sense of finality to the legal proceedings. The property at 227 Seymour Avenue was swiftly demolished by the city, actively erasing the physical footprint of the horrors committed there and replacing the house with a quiet community garden dedicated to the resilience of the survivors. Amanda, Gina, and Michelle embarked on long, incredibly difficult journeys of psychological and physical recovery, heavily relying on the overwhelming support of a shocked nation as they attempted to rebuild lives fundamentally fractured by extreme trauma. The exposure of Castro's crimes forced a nationwide reckoning regarding how easily severe domestic captivity can be concealed within densely populated, closely monitored urban environments. The profound strength required to survive such an ordeal remains a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance under conditions designed to systematically destroy the human psyche. While Castro utilized the chaos of a modern urban environment to conceal his atrocities behind a veneer of working-class normalcy, our next investigation requires a look back at an even more prominent community figure whose terrifying facade masked an extensive, subterranean graveyard beneath the very floorboards of his successful business. In the mid to late 1970s, the sprawling suburban landscape of Norwood Park Township, located just outside the city limits of Chicago, Illinois, provided an idyllic backdrop for middle-class American prosperity and civic engagement. John Wayne Gacy effectively weaponized this environment, meticulously constructing a public persona as a pillar of the community who was universally respected by his neighbors and local political figures. He operated a highly successful construction and contracting business called PDM Contractors, employing numerous young men from the surrounding neighborhoods and establishing himself as a reliable source of local economic opportunity. Beyond his professional endeavors, Gacy actively integrated himself into the political fabric of the township, serving as a Democratic precinct captain whose home was frequently used as a gathering place for local officials and community leaders. He further cemented his reputation as a benevolent local figure by regularly volunteering to entertain hospitalized children and attending neighborhood block parties performing as his alter ego, Pogo the Clown. This extensive network of civic and professional connections provided Gacy with a profound level of social capital, effectively granting him an invisible shield against any cursory scrutiny from local law enforcement or regulatory agencies. His large ranch-style home on Summerdale Avenue stood as a physical testament to his perceived success, functioning as the geographic center of his carefully curated life of suburban respectability. The community viewed him not merely as a neighbor, but as an indispensable asset who contributed heavily to the social and economic stability of the area, making the reality of his hidden life practically inconceivable to those who interacted with him daily. There was absolutely no outward indication that the jovial contractor hosting summer barbecues was simultaneously utilizing his property as an active burial ground for the young men he systematically hunted. This absolute baseline of deep-seated community trust is critical to understanding how Gacy managed to operate a prolific, localized killing machine for years without triggering any systemic alarms within the criminal justice system. The impenetrable facade of Gacy's suburban empire finally began to fracture irreparably on the frigid evening of December 11, 1978, initiating a rapid, catastrophic unraveling of his secret life. 15-year-old Robert Piest, a highly dependable high school student with no history of truancy or problematic behavior, vanished without a trace immediately after telling his mother he was stepping outside the pharmacy, where he worked, to speak with a contractor about a potential summer job. That contractor was explicitly identified as John Wayne Gacy, definitively establishing the first concrete, undeniable link between the prominent community figure and a sudden, highly suspicious disappearance of a local youth. When Piest failed to return to his mother within minutes, Her immediate and intense insistence that her son had not run away forced the Des Plaines Police Department to launch an urgent, highly focused investigation that completely bypassed the usual waiting periods for missing adolescents. Recognizing the highly anomalous nature of Piest's vanishing, detectives immediately zeroed in on Gacy, driving directly to his Somerdale Avenue residence to question him regarding his interactions with the missing teenager. Gacy's initial responses were marked by an unusual arrogance and a series of documented inconsistencies, immediately elevating the suspicions of seasoned investigators who recognized the subtle behavioral tells of a man attempting to manage a rapidly deteriorating lie. The behavioral evidence was further compounded when detectives observed a photo receipt belonging to another young man in Gacy's home, an item that completely contradicted his statements. This initial police interview fundamentally shifted the trajectory of the case, transforming Gacy from a respected local businessman into the primary target of an intense, unyielding homicide investigation. The localized panic surrounding Piest's disappearance completely stripped away the social armor Gacy had spent years cultivating, forcing law enforcement to treat his prominent status not as an alibi, but as a potential mechanism for predation. The undeniable timeline connecting Gacy directly to Piest's last known location represented the absolute point of no return, effectively trapping the predator in a rapidly tightening investigative net that would soon expose the full extent of his atrocities. As detectives began to thoroughly dissect Gacy's background, they uncovered a disturbing historical context of extreme violence and systemic judicial failure, specifically regarding young men who had actually survived his brutal attacks but were tragically ignored. Years prior to the Piest investigation, individuals such as Jeffrey Rignall and Robert Donnelly had managed to escape Gacy's violent clutches, enduring horrific episodes of physical torture, chloroform sedation, and severe sexual assault within the confines of the Somerdale residence. Rignall, who was attacked in early 1978, even went to the extraordinary length of conducting his own investigation after the police dismissed his initial report, eventually tracking down Gacy's license plate and presenting the authorities with undeniable evidence of his attacker's identity. Despite Rignall's detailed testimony and severe, medically documented injuries, the justice system of the era fundamentally failed to aggressively prosecute the case, largely due to systemic biases against the victim's lifestyles and Gacy's formidable social standing. Gacy's political connections and his ability to afford competent legal representation allowed him to completely manipulate the narrative, framing the encounters as consensual or completely denying they occurred. Similarly, Donnelly's harrowing account of being handcuffed and tortured was completely marginalized, allowing Gacy to comfortably evade legal consequences and emboldening his belief that he could operate with absolute impunity. He was held captive, brutally beaten, and released, only to find that law enforcement lacked the institutional will to pursue a pillar of the community based on his word alone. These surviving victims were effectively silenced by an institutional blindness that inherently trusted a well-connected, politically active contractor over young men deemed socially insignificant or unreliable by the police. The agonizing reality is that the machinery to stop Gacy existed long before 1978, but the critical intelligence provided by these brave survivors was systematically suppressed or mishandled by the very agencies designed to protect the public. As the Des Plaines detectives dug deeper into these buried files during the Piest investigation, the sheer volume of prior allegations painted a terrifying portrait of a prolific serial predator whose violence had escalated entirely unchecked. Recognizing the immense danger Gacy posed, law enforcement implemented a relentless, 24-hour physical surveillance operation, effectively placing the contractor under a claustrophobic psychological microscope in an attempt to force a critical error. The intense, round-the-clock surveillance generated an atmosphere of extreme psychological pressure, leading to a critical breakthrough when officers executing a secondary search warrant detected a highly distinct, inescapable biological odor emanating from the home's heating ducts. Gacy's erratic behavior during this surveillance period, including inviting officers for drinks while subtly taunting them, confirmed his deteriorating mental state as the reality of his imminent capture set in. On December 21, 1978, investigators armed with a comprehensive search warrant and the undeniable olfactory evidence of human decomposition returned to the Somerdale property to conduct a meticulous, structurally invasive examination of the residence. As evidence technicians navigated the incredibly cramped, dirt-floored crawl space located directly beneath the house, they began to systematically excavate the soil, utilizing small hand tools to carefully peel back the earth in the suffocating darkness. The environment was deeply contaminated, forcing investigators to work in highly restrictive spaces while breathing in the overpowering stench of decay that had saturated the foundation. The methodical digging quickly yielded a horrifying discovery when an investigator unearthed a human femur, immediately escalating the search from a missing persons inquiry into one of the largest mass murder crime scenes in the history of the United States. The physical unearthing of the first set of skeletal remains shattered the final remnants of Gacy's psychological defenses, leading him to offer a rambling, partial confession to his attorneys regarding the true nature of his property. Over the following days, the quiet suburban property was completely transformed into a massive forensic excavation site, as investigators meticulously mapped and recovered the remains of dozens of young men buried in agonizing proximity to one another. The sheer density of the graves required a grim, grueling logistical operation, with police physically dismantling the interior structure of the home to access the bodies hidden beneath the floorboards. Heavy machinery was eventually required to properly excavate the site without destroying the fragile skeletal evidence locked within the soil. In that claustrophobic, suffocating crawl space, the horrifying reality of Gacy's decade-long reign of terror was definitively exposed to the world, permanently destroying the illusion of safety that had defined the Norwood Park community. This grim excavation represented the absolute climax of the investigation, providing undeniable, devastating physical proof of the atrocities committed by the man who had hidden behind the mask of a jovial clown. The unprecedented excavation ultimately resulted in the recovery of 29 bodies from the Somerdale property, with 4 additional victims recovered from the nearby Des Plaines River, bringing the officially recognized death toll to 33 young men. The sheer volume of victims overwhelmed the local medical examiner's office, requiring a historic collaboration of forensic anthropologists and odontologists to properly catalog and identify the remains. John Wayne Gacy was subsequently indicted and stood trial in a highly publicized legal proceeding where his defense team unsuccessfully attempted to argue a plea of insanity, a strategy completely dismantled by the prosecution's evidence of his meticulous, calculated methodologies. He was convicted on 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death, spending 14 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in May 1994. The structural footprint of his crimes was permanently erased when his home was completely demolished shortly after the investigation, leaving an empty, haunting residential lot in the middle of the otherwise normal suburban neighborhood. The property sat vacant for decades, serving as a grim, silent monument to the catastrophic failure to protect the city's most vulnerable youth. Decades after his execution, law enforcement agencies utilizing advanced DNA phenotyping and forensic genealogy continue the agonizing process of identifying the remaining unknown victims, providing long-delayed closure to families who spent half a century trapped in uncertainty. Advances in genetic genealogy have recently restored the names to several young men who were previously known only as numbered victims, proving that the investigation into Gacy's destruction remains an active pursuit of justice. The systemic failures that allowed Gacy to operate for so long forced sweeping, permanent changes in how missing persons cases and survivor testimonies are handled by local and federal law enforcement agencies across the country. Gacy's ability to maintain a torture chamber beneath his floorboards while actively participating in local politics remains a deeply disturbing case study in the deceptive nature of extreme psychopathy. The sheer scale of his hidden crimes demonstrated how a predator could completely weaponize the concept of suburban safety, a terrifying dynamic that would reemerge decades later in a highly affluent neighborhood in Utah, where a sudden, violent intrusion in the dead of night would completely shatter a family's secure reality. In the early summer of 2002, the affluent Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah functioned as an enclave of profound security, characterized by sprawling homes, manicured lawns, and a deeply ingrained sense of communal trust. The Smart family epitomized this idealized suburban existence, living a life deeply anchored in their faith, community service, and the predictable rhythms of a large, closely knit household. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was a bright, devout, and accomplished teenager who spent her days playing the harp, riding horses, and participating actively in the social and religious activities of her local church. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, provided a highly structured and loving environment, ensuring their children were shielded from the harsher realities of the outside world while fostering a strong sense of familial duty and moral obligation. The physical layout of their expansive, multi-level home, situated near the foothills of the Wasatch Range, projected an aura of absolute safety, serving as a sanctuary where the children frequently slept with their windows open to let in the cool mountain breeze. There was absolutely nothing in their daily routines or social interactions to suggest that they were vulnerable to a targeted, violent intrusion from a malicious external force. The family operated within a sphere of complete innocence, trusting the implicit security of their affluent zip code and the protective vigilance of their surrounding neighbors. This baseline of undisturbed peace and domestic tranquility is crucial to understanding the profound psychological shock that was about to fracture their reality, demonstrating that even the most insulated environments are not immune to determined predators. The evening of June 4, 2002, concluded just like any other ordinary summer night, with the family retiring to their respective bedrooms, completely unaware that a meticulously planned violation of their sanctuary was already in motion. The profound sense of safety that had defined Elizabeth's entire childhood was mere hours away from being violently dismantled by an individual who had successfully blended into the background of their daily lives. The irreversible fracture of the Smart family's reality occurred in the absolute dead of night on June 5, 2002, transforming their secure home into the flashpoint of an unprecedented national crisis. While the rest of the household slept soundly, an intruder wielding a knife silently infiltrated the residence through an open window, navigating the dark hallways with terrifying familiarity until he reached the bedroom Elizabeth shared with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. The intruder, a religious fanatic named Brian David Mitchell, who had briefly worked as a handyman at the property under the alias Emmanuel, awakened Elizabeth and explicitly threatened to murder her entire family if she made a single sound. Paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming threat to her loved ones, the terrified 14-year-old complied with his whispered demands, silently rising from her bed and allowing herself to be marched out of her own home at knife point. The entire abduction was witnessed solely by young Mary Catherine, who remained frozen in her bed, pretending to be asleep in a state of absolute, petrifying terror as she watched her older sister being led away into the darkness. It was only after a grueling, agonizing period of paralyzing fear, roughly 2 hours later, that the 9-year-old finally found the courage to run to her parents' bedroom and alert them to the horrific reality that Elizabeth was gone. The immediate aftermath was characterized by total, suffocating panic as Ed and Lois frantically searched the house and the surrounding property, desperately hoping to find their daughter before officially dialing emergency services. The absolute point of no return had been crossed the moment Mitchell forced Elizabeth out the door, initiating a massive, frantic mobilization of local law enforcement who arrived to find a devastated family and a baffling lack of physical evidence. The sheer audacity of a perpetrator entering a crowded, affluent home and extracting a teenager without waking the parents instantly elevated the case to the highest levels of law enforcement priority, stripping away the illusion of security that had defined the neighborhood. This terrifying, silent extraction set the stage for one of the most agonizing and heavily publicized search efforts in modern American history, leaving a family trapped in a nightmare of unanswered questions. Over the next 9 agonizing months, the investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance evolved into an exhausted, nationwide media spectacle characterized by intense public scrutiny, systemic law enforcement missteps, and the relentless psychological torture of the victim. While police and the FBI established a massive command center and fielded thousands of tips, their primary investigative focus unfortunately fixated on Richard Ritchie, another handyman who had worked at the Smart residence, ultimately leading detectives down a prolonged and entirely fruitless dead end. Meanwhile, just miles away in the rugged terrain of the Wasatch Mountains, overlooking her own neighborhood, Elizabeth was forced into a horrific existence of extreme physical deprivation and continuous sexual assault under the absolute control of Mitchell and his complicit wife. Mitchell subjected the teenager to intense psychological conditioning, forcing her to wear heavy robes and a veil, renaming her, and threatening her with divine retribution if she attempted to escape or alert authorities. Elizabeth was forced to endure unimaginable conditions, often physically bound to trees during the day and forced to accompany her captors on forced marches, completely isolated from the massive search operation occurring directly below her in the Salt Lake Valley. The agonizing reality was that she was frequently hidden in plain sight, even being moved to California and back to Utah, navigating public spaces while hidden beneath layers of religious garments that successfully deflected cursory public attention. The investigation remained largely stalled until October 2002, when Mary Catherine experienced a sudden, crucial cognitive breakthrough, suddenly recalling the distinct voice of the kidnapper and identifying him to her parents as the itinerant street preacher, Emmanuel. This pivotal revelation forced investigators to radically pivot their search parameters, generating composite sketches of Mitchell that were heavily broadcasted across national television networks and fundamentally altering the trajectory of the entire manhunt. Despite this breakthrough, the grueling months continued to pass, testing the absolute limits of Elizabeth's endurance as she relied on complex internal survival mechanisms to maintain her sanity in an environment designed to completely break her spirit. She recognized that her physical survival depended entirely on feigning compliance with Mitchell's delusional prophecies, patiently waiting in silence for a microscopic opportunity to intercept the outside world. The unbearable tension surrounding the 9-month ordeal finally reached its explosive culmination on the afternoon of March 12, 2003, driven entirely by the vigilant observations of ordinary citizens operating on the suburban streets of Sandy, Utah. Several individuals, highly sensitized to the ongoing national manhunt and familiar with the recently publicized composite sketches, independently spotted 3 figures walking down the street wearing distinct, heavy religious robes that immediately triggered profound suspicion. Recognizing the chilling similarities between the male figure and the descriptions of the wanted street preacher, Emmanuel, these alert citizens immediately contacted local law enforcement, initiating a rapid and highly tense police interception. Within minutes, multiple police cruisers converged on the trio, physically separating Mitchell, Barzy, and the heavily veiled young woman to conduct immediate field interviews. Elizabeth, severely traumatized and heavily conditioned by months of Mitchell's violent threats against her family, initially hesitated to reveal her true identity, softly claiming to be a daughter named Augustine, as officers repeatedly pressed her for the truth. The officers, recognizing the distinct physical features hidden beneath the disguise and noting the young woman's extreme, trembling apprehension, gently but firmly continued their questioning, explicitly assuring her that she was finally safe from the man standing just feet away. In a heart-stopping moment of absolute courage that permanently severed her psychological chains, Elizabeth finally looked at the officers and definitively confirmed her identity, stating clearly that she was indeed Elizabeth Smart. This singular, definitive admission instantly dismantled the entire infrastructure of Mitchell's delusional captivity, transforming a tense street stop into the dramatic rescue of one of the most heavily sought after missing children in the nation. The immediate arrest of Mitchell and Barzy on the sidewalk permanently ended their reign of terror, instantly validating the unwavering hope of the Smart family and stunning a nation that had largely assumed the worst possible outcome. In that decisive moment on a suburban sidewalk, Elizabeth reclaimed the life that had been violently stolen from her in the middle of the night, permanently neutralizing the predator who had held her captive in plain sight. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's miraculous rescue initiated a prolonged and highly complex legal battle regarding the psychological competency of Brian David Mitchell, who actively attempted to disrupt the judicial process through bizarre courtroom outbursts and claims of divine instruction. After years of exhaustive psychiatric evaluations and legal maneuvering, Mitchell was officially deemed competent to stand trial in federal court, ultimately resulting in his 2010 conviction on charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor, for which he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee, having entered a plea agreement and occasionally cooperating with prosecutors, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and was eventually released in 2018 under strict supervision. Elizabeth Smart's return to her family was heavily documented by global media, yet she navigated the immense trauma of her reintegration with extraordinary grace, refusing to let the horrific events of her adolescence define the trajectory of her adult life. She actively transformed her unimaginable ordeal into a powerful platform for advocacy, becoming a prominent national voice for missing persons, lobbying for the implementation of the National AMBR Alert System, and working tirelessly to educate law enforcement on the complex psychological realities of prolonged captivity. Her resilience stands as a monumental testament to human endurance, proving that victims of extreme, organized abuse can not only survive, but actively dismantle the systems that allowed their captors to operate. The Smart case fundamentally altered how local law enforcement agencies handle immediate reports of missing children, permanently erasing the outdated assumption of voluntary runaway status in favor of rapid, overwhelming tactical response. While Elizabeth survived the harsh elements of the Utah mountains by enduring a highly mobile, psychologically manipulative captivity, our next investigation takes us to the rugged, remote terrain of Northern California, where a terrifyingly static, structurally reinforced bunker was designed to ensure victims never saw the sun again. Deep in the rugged, densely forested foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the unincorporated community of Wilseyville, California, offered an ideal sanctuary for individuals seeking profound isolation and absolute detachment from mainstream society. In the early 1980s, this remote terrain provided the perfect geographic camouflage for Leonard Lake, a former Marine and fervent survivalist who harbored an intense paranoia regarding impending global nuclear annihilation. Lake deliberately cultivated an off-the-grid lifestyle, leasing a secluded 2.5-acre property situated at the end of a heavily rutted, barely accessible dirt road that virtually guaranteed zero accidental interference from neighbors or passing motorists. To the few locals who occasionally interacted with him, Lake projected the image of a harmless, albeit eccentric, doomsday prepper who was simply committed to self-sufficiency and preparing for societal collapse. He shared this secluded existence with his accomplice, Charles Ng, a similarly disciplined and highly dangerous individual who had been dishonorably discharged from the military following a conviction for theft. Together, they transformed the Wilseyville property into a fortified compound, utilizing the dense canopy of trees and the natural topography of the mountains to completely shield their activities from any aerial or ground-level surveillance. The sheer isolation of the environment allowed them to operate with a terrifying level of unchecked autonomy, creating a localized vacuum where the standard rules of law and societal oversight simply ceased to exist. Their daily routines involved intense physical training, the stockpiling of vast quantities of weapons and ammunition, and the meticulous, secretive construction of a cinder block structure hidden behind their main cabin. There was absolutely nothing in the rugged beauty of the surrounding wilderness to suggest that it harbored an epicenter of calculated human destruction, allowing the duo to quietly lure victims into their heavily secured domain. This absolute baseline of geographic isolation and carefully maintained privacy is crucial to understanding how Lake and NG managed to construct and operate a subterranean nightmare without ever triggering the slightest suspicion from the outside world. The impenetrable veil of secrecy surrounding the Wilseyville compound was ultimately shattered not by a dramatic rescue or a massive law enforcement investigation, but by a completely mundane, arrogant miscalculation at a suburban hardware store miles away. On June 2, 1985, Lake and NG were browsing the aisles of a South San Francisco lumber yard when NG, acting with brazen and inexplicable recklessness, decided to steal a $75 vise, stuffing it into his jacket in full view of an observant store employee. When confronted by a manager in the parking lot, NG immediately became combative, discarding the stolen merchandise and fleeing the scene on foot, leaving his older accomplice to face the rapidly responding police officers alone. Lake, who had initially attempted to smooth over the situation and pay for the stolen item, was detained by officers who quickly noticed a disturbing series of anomalies regarding his vehicle and his personal identification. The 1980 Honda Prelude he was driving was registered to a man named Paul Cosner, who had been officially reported missing in San Francisco several months prior, instantly escalating a minor shoplifting incident into a high-stakes auto theft and potential missing persons inquiry. Furthermore, the driver's license Lake provided bore the name of Robin Stapley, another individual who had recently vanished without a trace, creating a deeply suspicious web of stolen identities that immediately put seasoned investigators on high alert. Realizing that the entire foundation of his hidden life was about to violently collapse, and that law enforcement would inevitably trace the vehicle back to his remote property, Lake made a swift, permanent operational decision while sitting in police custody. During a standard interrogation session at the South San Francisco police station, Lake requested a glass of water, discreetly retrieved a hidden cyanide capsule sewn into his clothing, and swallowed it before officers could intervene. The absolute suddenness of Lake's action plunged the investigation into a chaotic race against time, as detectives scrambled to decode the cryptic reality he was so desperate to protect. He collapsed into a fatal coma and died 4 days later, permanently silencing himself and effectively leaving investigators with a massive, localized mystery that demanded immediate, aggressive geographic exploration. Following Lake's sudden and calculated suicide, law enforcement agencies rapidly mobilized a comprehensive investigative effort to trace his final movements, eventually following the logistical breadcrumbs directly to the heavily wooded property in Wilseyville. As investigators breached the perimeter of the remote compound, they were initially confronted with a disorganized, sprawling collection of stolen vehicles, heavily modified firearms, and survivalist gear, painting a picture of intense, paranoid hoarding. However, as evidence technicians moved deeper into the property, their attention was drawn to a reinforced cinderblock structure located adjacent to the main cabin, a building that Lake had cryptically referred to in his notes as the dungeon. Upon breaching the heavy, fortified doors of this structure, detectives discovered a chilling, purpose-built environment designed exclusively for prolonged human captivity and extreme psychological torture, completely isolated from the outside world. The bunker featured multiple windowless cells equipped with heavy-duty padlocks, chains, and a hidden observation system that allowed the captors to monitor their victims constantly without entering the physical space. Investigators meticulously documented the grim reality of the space, noting the presence of stained sleeping bags, scattered women's clothing, and a terrifying array of restraints that confirmed the structure was not merely a fallout shelter, but an active, localized prison. Authorities established a highly secure perimeter, treating the entire acreage as a massive, deeply contaminated crime scene that required absolute precision and heavy resources to properly process. The sheer scale of the operation began to crystallize as police initiated a massive forensic excavation of the surrounding 2.5 acres, utilizing heavy machinery and specialized search teams to systematically sift through the dense soil. This grueling, highly methodical search operation required investigators to navigate treacherous terrain and handle deeply disturbing biological evidence. As the property slowly began to yield the tragic, fragmented remains of families, neighbors, and associates who had vanished over the previous years, The agonizingly slow process of unearthing this localized graveyard forced law enforcement to confront the reality that Lake and NG had operated a highly efficient, entirely self-contained killing machine specifically designed to ensure that no victim would ever successfully escape. The investigation reached its absolute, horrifying zenith when detectives recovered a cache of deeply disturbing physical evidence buried near the bunker, permanently illuminating the sociopathic philosophy that drove the killings. Investigators unearthed Lake's extensive handwritten journals, which explicitly detailed a terrifying, misogynistic manifesto he dubbed Operation Miranda, a comprehensive plan to abduct women, strip them of their identities, and hold them indefinitely as subservient captives in the Wilseyville bunker. The sheer horror of the written words was unequivocally corroborated when police discovered a collection of hidden videotapes, effectively transforming the abstract written plans into undeniable, visually documented atrocities. These chilling recordings featured Lake and NG actively terrorizing heavily bound female captives, systematically stripping away their hope by calmly explaining that their families had already been murdered and that their absolute compliance was the only avenue for continued survival. The psychological destruction captured on these tapes provided prosecutors with unprecedented, irrefutable evidence of the captors' organized sadism, completely neutralizing any potential legal defense based on accidental death or misunderstanding. The recovery of these tapes simultaneously triggered a massive, highly publicized international manhunt for Charles Ng, who had managed to evade the initial police net in South San Francisco and flee across the border into Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation collaborated in an intense, exhaustive search for the fugitive, knowing that a highly trained, violently unpredictable serial killer was actively operating within the general public. The international cooperation between American and Canadian authorities showcased a highly synchronized effort to permanently neutralize a borderless threat that possessed the capability to strike again at any moment. This desperate high-stakes pursuit culminated in July 1985, when NG was finally apprehended in a department store in Calgary, Alberta, following another violent altercation with a security guard over a minor shoplifting attempt, mirroring the exact behavioral flaw that had initially exposed the Wilseyville operation. His capture definitively neutralized the immediate physical threat to the public, shifting the monumental weight of the case from an active manhunt into a grueling, decades-long legal battle for ultimate accountability. The sheer volume of forensic evidence recovered from the Wilseyville compound was staggering, with investigators ultimately collecting over 45 pounds of fragmented human bone, making precise identification a monumental challenge for forensic anthropologists. Despite the extreme degradation of the remains, authorities were able to definitively link Lake and NG to the murders of at least 11 individuals, including 2 entire families and several young women, whose lives were violently erased within the cinderblock bunker. Charles Ng immediately initiated a prolonged, highly combative legal strategy to aggressively fight his extradition from Canada, heavily leveraging the country's strict opposition to the death penalty to delay his return to the United States for over 6 years. The Canadian government eventually ruled that his extradition was legal and necessary, stripping away his final layers of international protection and forcing him to answer for the atrocities committed in California. Following his eventual extradition to California in 1991, NG continued to manipulate the judicial system, utilizing a seemingly endless series of pretrial motions, attorney dismissals, and jurisdictional challenges to drag the proceedings out for nearly another decade. The psychological toll on the victims' families during this agonizingly slow judicial process was immense, as they were repeatedly forced to endure NG's calculated courtroom theatrics and endless delay tactics. Finally, in 1999, after one of the most expensive and protracted criminal trials in the state's history, a jury unequivocally convicted Charles Ng on 11 counts of first-degree murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to death. The judge overseeing the case explicitly noted the extreme, sociopathic cruelty demonstrated in the videotapes, ensuring the maximum penalty was applied to prevent him from ever endangering the public again. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Having exhausted countless appeals while providing absolutely no answers or closure to the grieving families whose loved ones were discarded in the remote California wilderness. The Wilseyville property was ultimately cleared and sold, yet the horrific legacy of the bunker remains a foundational case study in the extreme danger posed by organized predators operating in complete geographic isolation. While Lake and NG utilized the vast, unforgiving wilderness to permanently conceal their captives from the world, our next case demonstrates a completely different terrifying reality, proving that decades of absolute isolation can be successfully maintained within the seemingly secure confines of a heavily populated residential backyard. In the early summer of 1991, the picturesque resort city of South Lake Tahoe, California, projected an image of serene, undisturbed safety nestled among the towering pines and crystal clear waters of the Sierra Nevada. This tight-knit, heavily forested community relied heavily on the seasonal tourism industry, creating a localized environment where residents inherently trusted their neighbors and children routinely navigated the quiet suburban streets without fear. 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard was a bright, energetic fifth grader who embodied the carefree innocence of the era, known for her vibrant personality and her deep affection for her family. Her daily routine was entirely predictable and fundamentally secure, anchored by the familiar morning ritual of walking from her home to the local school bus stop situated just down the road. On the morning of June 10, dressed in a bright pink windbreaker and carrying her backpack, she stepped out of her house into the crisp mountain air to begin this highly routine commute. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, stood in the open doorway of their residence, keeping a watchful, loving eye on her as she made her way down the quiet, tree-lined street toward the designated intersection. The surrounding neighborhood was just beginning to stir, characterized by the typical ambient sounds of a suburban morning and the comforting illusion of absolute security. There was absolutely nothing in the tranquil environment to suggest that a highly mobile, deeply depraved predatory team had infiltrated this idyllic setting with the express purpose of stealing a child. The community's profound sense of safety functioned as an invisible vulnerability, completely blinding both the residents and local authorities to the reality that dangerous individuals could seamlessly navigate their peaceful roads. This foundational baseline of ordinary, secure childhood existence is vital to comprehending the sheer, devastating shock of the violence that was about to unfold in plain sight. The serene normalcy of the morning was violently and permanently fractured when a gray Ford sedan slowly approached the bus stop, occupied by a convicted sex offender named Philip Garrido and his compliant wife Nancy. Operating with calculated, terrifying precision, the couple executed a sudden U-turn, positioning their vehicle directly alongside the unsuspecting 11-year-old girl as she waited quietly by the side of the road. Without a moment of hesitation, Nancy Garrido lunged from the vehicle and grabbed the terrified child, utilizing a powerful stun gun to instantly incapacitate JC and neutralize any physical resistance. The violent, electrically induced shock forced the young girl into the back of the car, completely erasing her from the quiet street in a matter of desperate, chaotic seconds. Carl Probin, witnessing the horrifying abduction unfold from his vantage point down the street, immediately sprang into action, grabbing a mountain bike and frantically pedaling after the speeding sedan in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled pursuit. Despite his absolute maximum physical exertion, the vehicle rapidly accelerated away, disappearing into the winding mountain roads and leaving the devastated stepfather standing helplessly in its wake. This catastrophic extraction represented the absolute point of no return, instantly transforming a routine school commute into a massive, frantic missing child investigation that would paralyze the Lake Tahoe community. Law enforcement agencies initiated immediate roadblock protocols and launched extensive grid searches throughout the treacherous mountain passes, but the highly organized nature of the abduction left them with effectively zero actionable forensic leads. The gray sedan had vanished like a ghost, carrying JC far away from the massive search operation and transporting her down into the densely populated flatlands of the San Francisco Bay Area. The devastating speed and coordination of the Garridos demonstrated a chilling level of predatory competence, setting the stage for an 18-year nightmare that would unfold completely undetected behind the fences of a suburban residence. For the next 18 agonizing years, JC was subjected to a hidden existence of absolute isolation, severe psychological conditioning, and relentless abuse within a meticulously concealed backyard compound in Antioch, California. Philip Garrido, leveraging his background as a skilled tradesman, had illegally constructed a labyrinthine network of soundproof sheds, high fences, and heavy tarps that effectively blocked the compound from any aerial or ground-level visibility. Within this claustrophobic, structurally hidden environment, Garrido subjected his captive to extreme psychological warfare, utilizing manipulative religious dogma to systematically dismantle her identity and enforce absolute compliance. The profound horrors of her captivity were drastically compounded when she was forced to endure 2 medically unassisted, high-risk pregnancies, giving birth to 2 daughters in the squalor of the backyard sheds before she even reached adulthood. Despite having 2 young children to protect, JC was trapped in an impossible, terrifying reality where any attempt to rebel or escape would inevitably result in severe, potentially lethal consequences for both herself and her daughters. The most infuriating aspect of this prolonged captivity was the systemic, catastrophic failure of the California parole system, which completely failed to properly monitor Garrido, despite his status as a high-risk federal parolee with a history of severe sexual violence. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, parole officers conducted numerous visits to the Antioch property, yet they repeatedly failed to inspect the heavily barricaded backyard or register the obvious structural anomalies hiding the captives. Garrido operated a printing business out of his home, occasionally forcing JC to interact with completely oblivious clients under the false alias of Alyssa, demonstrating his terrifying confidence in his ability to deceive the public. As the years slowly progressed, JC focused her entire existence on shielding her daughters from the worst of Garrido's psychological instability, utilizing complex internal survival mechanisms to maintain her sanity in an environment devoid of hope. The official police investigation into her disappearance had long since grown entirely cold, leaving her isolated in a heavily populated suburban neighborhood where freedom was literally feet away, yet completely unattainable due to the massive psychological and physical barriers erected by her captors. The agonizing, decades-long nightmare finally reached its unexpected culmination in late August of 2009, triggered not by a massive police raid, but by Garrido's increasingly erratic behavior and the sharp instincts of vigilant public servants. Driven by profound religious delusions, Garrido traveled to the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, accompanied by the 2 daughters, to distribute his bizarre, self-published theological tracts to passing college students. The deeply unsettling dynamic between the older man and the 2 pale, unusually submissive girls immediately caught the attention of UC Berkeley campus police officer Lisa Campbell, who initiated a routine, non-confrontational inquiry. During this interaction, Garrido's bizarre rhetoric and defensive posture prompted Campbell to conduct a comprehensive background check, which instantly revealed his status as a registered sex offender on active, lifetime parole. Recognizing the immense potential danger, Campbell immediately contacted Garrido's designated parole officer, Allie Jacobs, who aggressively demanded that Garrido bring the mysterious women into the parole office for an official, mandated meeting the following morning. On August 26, 2009, Garrido arrived at the Concord parole office flanked by his wife Nancy, the 2 daughters, and a visibly terrified, deeply withdrawn woman he continued to refer to as Alyssa. The highly experienced parole officers immediately separated the group, recognizing the distinct, palpable fear radiating from the older woman and actively pressing her for the truth regarding her actual identity and her relationship to the parolee. During this incredibly tense, heavily monitored interrogation, the immense psychological dam that Garrido had spent 18 years constructing finally broke under the gentle, persistent questioning of the authorities. In a moment of monumental, life-altering courage, she looked at the officers and officially dismantled the horrific alias she had carried for nearly 2 decades, explicitly stating her true name and confirming that she was the child stolen from Lake Tahoe in 1991. This singular, definitive admission instantly transformed the routine parole inquiry into one of the most astonishing rescues in modern law enforcement history, permanently neutralizing the predators and triggering an immediate, massive criminal investigation. The immediate arrest of Philip and Nancy Garrido dismantled their localized empire of abuse, leading to a swift, heavily publicized legal proceeding where the overwhelming weight of the evidence forced them to accept comprehensive plea agreements. Philip Garrido was formally sentenced to an astounding 431 years to life in state prison, guaranteeing he would never again pose a threat to society, while Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life for her crucial, active role in the abduction and captivity. The state of California faced immense, furious public backlash for the catastrophic oversight failures of the parole department, ultimately resulting in a historic $20 million settlement awarded to JC to ensure her lifelong financial security and necessary medical care. JC's eventual reunion with her mother, who had never abandoned the hope of finding her daughter alive, was a profoundly moving conclusion to a case that had haunted the region for nearly 20 years. She subsequently published highly detailed memoirs documenting her incredible survival and founded the JYC Foundation, a vital organization dedicated to providing psychological support and resources to families recovering from severe trauma and abduction. The structural footprint of her nightmare was completely eradicated when authorities dismantled the elaborate backyard compound in Antioch, ensuring the space could never again be utilized to harbor such profound human suffering. Her remarkable ability to reintegrate into society and raise her daughters with love and stability stands as an incredible testament to the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. The case fundamentally revolutionized how high-risk parolees are monitored in the state, mandating significantly stricter oversight protocols and aggressive property inspections to prevent similar tragedies. However, the terrifying reality of suburban captivity extends beyond the failure of the parole system, highlighting the insidious ways a predator can weaponize an entire neighborhood's trust to conceal their darkest compulsions. This chilling dynamic brings us directly to our final, horrifying investigation, returning to the very streets of Cleveland to examine the structural labyrinth and the initial, devastating abduction of Michelle Knight that laid the foundation for Ariel Castro's House of Horrors. In the working-class enclave of Tremont in Cleveland, Ohio, the bustling environment of Seymour Avenue functioned as a densely packed residential corridor where neighbors lived in close proximity, sharing the daily routines of urban existence. Ariel Castro, the owner of a two-story home situated precisely in the middle of this busy street, successfully cultivated an outward persona as an affable, albeit slightly intense, neighborhood fixture. For years, he was known to the community primarily as an employed municipal school bus driver and a talented bass guitarist who frequently played in local bands, utilizing these public roles to project a facade of complete, undeniable normalcy. His residence at 2207 Seymour Avenue appeared from the exterior to be just another aging, modestly maintained urban home, blending seamlessly into the architectural fabric of the surrounding block. However, beneath this incredibly deceptive exterior, Castro was actively transforming the interior blueprint of his property into a highly fortified, compartmentalized labyrinth specifically designed for prolonged human concealment and extreme psychological terror. He meticulously altered the internal architecture, heavily boarding up windows, reinforcing bedroom doors with heavy-duty exterior padlocks, and rigging rudimentary alarm systems to ensure absolute control over the hidden environment. The physical layout of the house was weaponized to isolate its occupants, with distinct zones created to separate his public life on the ground floor from the subterranean, like nightmare he was constructing on the upper levels and in the basement. This calculated structural modification allowed him to host family gatherings, entertain friends, and interact with his neighbors on the front porch, while completely muting the horrifying reality that existed mere inches behind his barricaded interior walls. There was absolutely no outward visual or auditory evidence to suggest that the seemingly gregarious musician was actively orchestrating a highly localized, domestic dungeon in the heart of a major American city. This profound baseline of community deception is essential to understanding the terrifying mechanics of his operation, highlighting how a sociopathic predator can exploit the anonymity and ambient noise of urban life to completely mask a decade-long atrocity. The terrifying initiation of Castro's localized empire of violence occurred on August 23, 2002, when 21-year-old Michelle Knight disappeared under circumstances that fundamentally altered the dark trajectory of the Seymour Avenue property. Michelle, a young mother grappling with complex personal challenges and a difficult custody battle, was navigating the chaotic urban landscape of Cleveland when she crossed paths with Castro, who presented himself as a sympathetic acquaintance offering a ride. Operating with a predatory instinct for vulnerability, Castro lured her to his residence under the highly specific, deceptive guise of offering her a puppy for her young son, a manipulative tactic designed to exploit her maternal desperation. The absolute point of no return was crossed the moment Michelle stepped through the threshold of 207 Seymour Avenue, instantly transitioning from the open freedom of the city into a meticulously prepared, suffocating environment of absolute captivity. Once inside, Castro violently subdued her, binding her with heavy chains and forcing her into the barricaded upstairs rooms, thereby establishing the grim, terrifying reality of the dungeon he would operate for the next decade. Michelle's sudden vanishing from the streets of Cleveland was tragically overlooked by a criminal justice system that often marginalizes the disappearances of adults with complicated backgrounds, resulting in a devastatingly minimal law enforcement response. Because she was legally classified as an adult who had voluntarily severed ties with her family, detectives failed to recognize the sinister nature of her absence, allowing the investigative trail to freeze almost immediately upon her abduction. This systemic institutional blindness provided Castro with the exact cover he needed to refine his methods of extreme physical confinement, solidifying his confidence in his ability to kidnap and hold victims without triggering any significant municipal alarm. Michelle became the agonizing test subject for his architectural modifications, enduring the initial, brutal transition into a life characterized by total isolation, severe sensory deprivation, and the constant threat of lethal violence. Her abduction firmly cemented the house on Seymour Avenue as a permanently active crime scene, setting a horrific precedent that would eventually consume the lives of Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus in the years to follow. Over the course of the next 11 years, Michelle Knight endured an existence defined by unimaginable, systematic torture, bearing the absolute brunt of Castro's violent psychopathy as he expanded his operation to include 2 additional captives. She was subjected to a relentless campaign of physical and psychological destruction, enduring forced starvation, prolonged periods of being chained in agonizing stress positions, and horrific physical beatings that resulted in permanent physical injuries. Castro specifically weaponized Michelle's body and spirit, violently terminating her multiple forced pregnancies through targeted, severe physical trauma, a calculated cruelty that highlighted the absolute depths of his depravity. Despite her profound suffering, Michelle developed an extraordinary, silent resilience, frequently absorbing Castro's rage and taking physical punishments to actively protect Amanda and Gina from the full magnitude of his violence. The sheer terror of their confinement was severely compounded by the repeated, catastrophic failures of local authorities, including multiple instances where police and child protective services visited the property regarding exterior complaints, but failed to breach the threshold. On several agonizing occasions, police cruisers parked directly outside the house to investigate localized disturbances, yet the officers never detected the desperate, silent struggle for survival occurring just feet away behind the heavily boarded windows. Castro utilized an aggressive, deeply manipulative psychological warfare, constantly reminding the women of these institutional failures to enforce the devastating belief that the outside world had completely abandoned them. He forced them to watch televised news reports regarding the massive searches for Amanda and Gina, while cruelly reminding Michelle that no one was actively looking for her. An attempt to completely eradicate her sense of self-worth. The internal dynamics of the house evolved into a complex, agonizing holding pattern, where the captives utilized extreme patience and microscopic observations of Castro's deteriorating discipline to maintain a desperate, fragile grasp on their sanity. Michelle's unwavering determination to survive and shield the younger girls became the crucial, invisible scaffolding that prevented the complete psychological collapse of the captives, slowly biding time until the structural integrity of their prison finally failed. The suffocating decade-long paralysis of the Seymour Avenue dungeon violently shattered on May 6, 2013, when Amanda Berry successfully breached the compromised exterior door, instantly triggering a massive, highly tactical law enforcement invasion of the property. Within minutes of Amanda's frantic emergency call from a neighboring porch, heavily armed Cleveland police officers descended upon the street, shattering the front door and initiating a rapid, tense clearance of the dark, labyrinthine structure. As the tactical teams forcefully navigated the cluttered, barricaded hallways, they were immediately confronted by the horrifying visual evidence of prolonged captivity, discovering thick metal chains, heavy-duty padlocks, and rudimentary alarms affixed to the interior doors. The officers aggressively breached the heavily fortified upstairs rooms, their flashlights piercing the oppressive darkness to reveal a deeply traumatized Michelle Knight, who emerged from the shadows of her prison, trembling with absolute disbelief. Upon seeing the uniformed officers storming her barricaded room, Michelle threw herself into the arms of a responding policeman, clinging to him with immense, desperate force as she finally realized that the 11-year nightmare was abruptly, permanently over. The visceral impact of discovering living human beings chained within the walls of a seemingly ordinary urban home left seasoned law enforcement veterans completely stunned, transforming the quiet residential property into the epicenter of a global media shockwave. Gina DeJesus was simultaneously recovered from a separate, heavily secured room, ensuring that all three women were safely extracted from the toxic environment and immediately transported to local medical facilities for urgent, comprehensive trauma evaluation. The chaotic adrenaline-fueled extraction permanently obliterated Castro's meticulously constructed reality, completely exposing the depths of his depravity to a community that had unknowingly harbored a monster for over a decade. The overwhelming physical evidence of the chains, the boarded windows, and the squalid conditions provided undeniable, irrefutable proof of the extreme torture, ensuring that the judicial system would have an impenetrable case against the perpetrator. In those frantic, decisive moments of liberation, the immense strength of the survivors unequivocally triumphed over the sadistic architecture of their captor, permanently closing the doors on the most notorious house of horrors in modern American history. Confronted with a mountainous volume of irrefutable forensic evidence, definitive DNA analysis, and the surviving testimonies of his three victims, Ariel Castro was completely stripped of his ability to manipulate the narrative within the judicial system. To avoid the absolute certainty of the death penalty, Castro ultimately accepted a comprehensive plea agreement, formally pleading guilty to an astonishing 937 criminal counts, which heavily featured charges of aggravated murder related to the forced termination of Michelle's pregnancies. The presiding judge delivered a scathing, unprecedented sentence of life imprisonment, plus 1,000 consecutive years without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the predator would never again breathe free air or endanger the public. This massive legal victory was dramatically punctuated just 1 month into his incarceration, when Castro committed suicide by hanging himself in his heavily monitored prison cell, permanently terminating his own life, rather than facing the consequences of his atrocities. Following his death, the city of Cleveland moved rapidly to completely eradicate the physical footprint of his crimes, authorizing the immediate, highly publicized demolition of 227 Seymour Avenue to ensure it would never become a macabre monument. The structure was systematically torn down by heavy machinery as the local community and the survivors themselves watched, replacing the site of unimaginable suffering with a quiet, open space that symbolized healing and collective resilience. Michelle Knight, the first victim taken and the one who endured the longest and most severe abuse, emerged from the darkness as a profoundly powerful advocate, legally changing her name to Lily Rose Lee and publishing a detailed memoir of her unbelievable survival. Her extraordinary journey from absolute despair to triumphant independence stands as the ultimate refutation of Castro's psychological warfare, proving that the human spirit can withstand and overcome the most organized, concentrated forms of malicious destruction. The exposure of the Seymour Avenue dungeon fundamentally altered the national conversation regarding missing persons cases and community vigilance, serving as a permanent, terrifying reminder that unspeakable horrors can be hidden behind the most ordinary suburban facades. As we step back from these 10 harrowing descents into localized hells, we are forced to confront the chilling reality of what might be occurring right next door, leading us to our final thoughts on these incredible stories of endurance. The true terror of these 10 cases lies in the chilling realization that such profound darkness can thrive completely undetected behind the mundane facades of our own neighborhoods, leaving us to wonder, if these predators could build hidden prisons just feet away from our daily lives, what else might be lurking in plain sight behind the locked door next to yours? Thank you for watching.